Welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg, here today to talk to you about two more books that I finished here in the month of June. And now it's going to be interesting. I feel like a lot of the time when you do a review, you point out some of the things that feel like flaws, and it ends up sounding like you didn't really like the book. So I want to be very clear, I did really like both of these books. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Jeanette Winterson's Lighthousekeeping. I had been really looking forward to reading this for a very long time. Interestingly though, it was kind of misrepresented to me. The person who told me about it talked about it as if it's a coming out story for a lesbian girl. I think in hindsight, she was trying to talk about how much this book meant to her in her own coming out process, and somehow that got confused with the book, because this is very much not a coming out story, at least not in the traditional sense of the term. But it is a very beautiful book, and I enjoyed it. It's just funny how when your expectation is really set up in a specific way, when that's not what you get, it feels off in a certain way. And again, I really did like this. So I've been wanting to read Jeanette Winterson for a very long time. She also has a book called Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which is a classic in the genre. I prioritized Lighthousekeeping because of that recommendation somebody had given me, and I really enjoyed it. So it is the story of a girl named Silver. Her father is not in the picture at all. Her mother dies, and she ends up in the care of a lighthouse keeper named Pew, who makes her his apprentice. And as she learns the business of lighthouse keeping, he tells her stories. And these stories alternate back and forth with the quote-unquote reality of her living with Pew and growing up. There is a sort of coming-of-age element of this book, but what is actually interesting is that the fact that Silver is a lesbian is treated very unremarkably. It is mentioned that later in life she has girlfriends, and it's not remarked on at all beyond that. And actually, that is kind of refreshing, because really, the fact of somebody's sexuality is just another part of who they are. I frequently feel like when people talk about me being gay is the only thing that matters, it gets irritating. So seeing it handled in this really matter-of-fact way, where it's just handled in an offhand way, it was really interesting. I appreciated that. I will say there is a lot of... So Jeanette Winterson is also a poet. This book is written in a very poetic way. I will say there are parts of this book where something really gorgeous will strike me from a page, and then later on that same page, it's like getting hit in the chest, where it's like, oh, that's beautiful. And then later on the same page, it's just like, oh, too far. And I think it's a shame, because that, combined with the wrong expectation that I went into this book with, kind of colored the experience a bit. But I really enjoyed it anyway. And I do wish some of the language is a little bit scaled back, because sometimes it feels too much. However, what I like in this book, I really like a lot. And just really quickly, one thing that I really enjoyed about the book was the opening. It's "My mother called me Silver. I was born part precious metal, part pirate. I have no father. There's nothing unusual about that. Even children who do have fathers are often surprised to see them. My own father came out of the sea and went back that way. He was crew on a fishing boat that harbored with us one night when the waves were crashing like dark glass. His splintered hull shored him for long enough to drop anchor inside my mother. Shoals of babies vied for life. I won." That's beautiful. I thought that was a great way to start a book. And then there are all these little interludes throughout, where somebody asks another person to tell them a story. One of my favorites is, "Tell me a story, Pew. What kind of story, child? A story with a happy ending. There's no such thing in all the world as a happy ending as an ending." And I thought that was a really beautiful sentiment. It really made me think a lot. So ultimately, I really enjoyed this book. It was not what I thought I was getting into by any means, but I really did enjoy it. I'm glad I read it. And I am very much looking forward to reading more books by Jeanette Winterson, including Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. She has a book coming out this year called Frankenstein that sounds really intriguing. So I'm glad I finally got around to reading Jeanette Winterson, and can't wait to explore more. The other book that I want to talk to you about, I listened to on audio. It's Boy Erased by Garrard Conley. This is maybe familiar to you because there was a movie adaptation of it last year. The book it's a memoir of Garrard Conley growing up in a very religious family, and his parents sent him to experience conversion therapy when they found out that he was gay. As such, the book can be very harrowing, very upsetting, and also very powerful because it talks about his experience and the shame that he felt, the anger and confusion that he felt, and ultimately his path toward acceptance of himself and even his family's acceptance of him, even in some cases begrudging acceptance of him. And in those regards, it is gorgeous. I will say, I thought some of it was overwritten. Some of the description seemed too much. I thought the structure of the book was a little unnecessarily complicated. That could be colored by the fact that I listened to this on audio, because one thing I've really noticed listening to novels a lot is that when a novel or a memoir moves back and forth in time, it can be difficult to orient yourself when you're listening to an audiobook, because you don't necessarily get the little breaks that come in a book that let you know, okay, new section. And those are really helpful to help you ground yourself in where you are. So to me, listening to the audio, I frequently had to like back up a little bit and figure out where in time I was, because nothing happens in a linear structure. Everything happens in a kind of choppy way. To give an example, he goes to Love in Action, which is the conversion camp, and the book will go back and talk about him growing up, and then he'll be back at Love in Action, and then he'll be talking about his experience in college and the thing where he was raped by a man, which is what got him into this situation with his parents. The person who raped him outed him to his parents. So not only did he have to deal with the trauma of this sexual assault, he had to deal with conversion therapy, which is one of the things about the book that is kind of harrowing and can be difficult to read. So if that is a trigger for you, know it going in. After his parents find out, and before he ends up in Love in Action, his mother wants to send him to a doctor to have his hormones tested, and then that gets dropped. So I don't know page numbers because I was listening to the audio, but about an hour and a half later, just as I was thinking to myself, whatever happened with the doctor and the hormone check? And then it got back to that, and he ends up going to the doctor. So because it was done out of step, and everything's felt out of step, not only did I get kind of confused about where I was, probably because of the audio, but it felt like there were threads that got left and did get picked up later, but like much later. So and again, this is where it really comes in, where it sounds like I'm complaining a lot about a book, but I really enjoyed this book. I think it's an important book. I'm particularly glad that I read it during Pride Month. I think it is unfortunately something that is still very relevant to a lot of people and a lot of situations, and I think there's enough of an urgency around this that people should definitely read this book, take it in, experience it, because this is something that happens to a lot of people even now. And don't want to get political, but with the current administration being what it is a particularly urgent and relevant story. So even though I think it is slightly overwritten, the message itself is there, and it needs to be picked up. And I'm very thankful to Garrard Conley for telling it and for putting it out there and really being outspoken about his experience. If you follow him on Twitter, he is very outspoken about continuing issues and about what happened to him in the past. Interestingly, the pastor who was running Love in Action while he was there later came out or came out again, I guess I should say, and is now married to a man. So that is an interesting coda to this book. And there you go. Those are two more books that I finished in the month of June. If you have read either of these books, I would really love to hear what you thought of them. And if you have recommendations for where I should go next. With Jeanette Winterson, I'm thinking Oranges Are the Only Fruit. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit would be the next place, but she has a lot of other books. I've heard good things about Sexing the Cherry, and I don't really know anything about the other books that she has written. So I would appreciate recommendations based on that. When I talk to you next time, I will discuss Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. Can't wait to talk to you about that one. And I would also love to hear what you've been reading, if you've been reading anything. Hopefully you have. And as always, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I really appreciate it. If you are not subscribed, I hope you enjoyed this enough to maybe follow along. And I'll be back again. Until then, happy reading.